Likutei Sichos Chelik Chav Gimel, volume 23, the second Sicha for Parshas Korach. This Sicha will explain the reasons for and the effect of all the various gifts that Hashem had allotted to the Kohanim, which happen to be mentioned in our Parsha. In short, it's worthwhile to familiarize ourselves with the narrative here so we get a better appreciation of what's going on. So in the Parsha, there was, of course, the challenge of Korach against the priesthood, the kahuna of Aaron, and then those who stood up against Aaron, they all died. They were either burnt or swallowed. Later, when the people came to complain, again, they cried out, they challenged. Hashem said to take all the staffs, that's the staff of each of the leaders of each respective tribe, and laid them down in the Mishkan, and in the morning, it was the staff of Aaron who represented not only the Kohanim, but the entire tribe of Levi that blossomed and showed signs of growth. Later, Hashem says, later in the Parsha, Hashem says to Aaron that, behold, I give you the various matonos kahuna, the gifts that I give for the Kohanim. Let's just familiarize ourselves with the verse that pertains to this Sicha. It says, "Vaydaber Hashem al Aaron." Hashem spoke to Aaron. He says, "Vani hinei nosati lecha es mishmeres t'lmoisei." And I, hinei, behold, I give to you the charge of my gift. L'chol kodesh b'nei Yisrael, for all the holies of the Jewish people. L'chon esatim l'moshcha, to you I have given them as a distinction. Ulevanecha, unto your children. L'chok olam, for a internal portion or internal decree forever and forever. That is in chapter 18, verse 8. Perikut Ches, Pasuk Ches. Later in Pasuk Yutes, Hashem repeats this, and he says that I'm giving this all to you after describing in detail many of the actual gifts. He says, this is L'chak Olam, this is again for an eternal portion or eternal decree. Bris Melach Olam. This is like a covenant of the everlasting covenant of the salt. And Rashi says, what does that mean? What does salt have to do with anything? So Rashi says, just like salt, there's a special covenant that Hashem made with salt. That salt never spoils. It never decays. It can last forever and ever. So too, this promise to the Kohanim is eternal, is forever. So that's one thing to familiarize ourselves with to get the general idea. Now let's go into the actual some of the actual points or concepts that we will cover in the Sicha. So you have the 24 gifts of the Kohanim. Chav Daled Matnis Kahuna. In general, is the various gifts that one has to give, various offerings, whether it's from produce, whether it's from karbonis, whether when one slaughters an animal, the skin, the actual parts of the animal. Some of them are exclusive to the Beis HaMikdash when you bring an offering, but many of them are outside of the Beis HaMikdash, meaning when a person, collects their harvest and so on and so forth, that's when, or the shears their sheep, that can be anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, and so on. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with is something that we're perhaps well familiar with, the Klolei Rashi, some of the rules in Rashi. Number one, when Rashi connects two things, two ideas, or two explanations, which seemingly are not necessarily connected, but he brings them under the same heading, under the same Divrei Maschil, as a continuing, as a flowing explanation, that means that they are inherently connected. Another thing, Rashi, not only in his general explanation of things is it very precise, but even the words, the choice of expression that Rashi uses is very telling and very precise in bringing out the beauty of the point that Rashi is trying to bring out. Another thing, we know that many times Rashi is actually drawing on a source. Not many times, all the times. So sometimes it's very obvious. He's drawing on a source of his pirush, whether it's from a medrash, whether it's from a Gemara. And for example, in this case, in this Rashi, he's drawing from the Sifri. However, it's very telling when Rashi actually deviates from the verbiage of his source, in other words, from the expressions that are used in this source, and he prefers another expression, that tells us that according to Pshutei Shomika, according to the basic meaning of the pasuk, you need to change it, and it has a lot to say, the fact that Rashi changes it, as we'll find out in this Sikha. Another concept to familiarize ourselves with is Geneva, stealing. What is the idea of Geneva versus Gzela? So there's a robber and there's a thief. Well, in the Torah, when one steals as a gazlan, which means openly, goes out there brazenly and steals from someone, of course he has to pay back. Of course it's a sin. But the Torah doesn't penalize him as much. However, if one steals in a discreet manner, in other words, he does it in a way that no one should notice that he's doing it, because he's, quote, afraid of man more than he's afraid of God, then when he gets caught, the Torah penalizes him with paying kefil, with paying double, which is basically not only paying back what he stole, but also there's a fine that's imposed upon him, a punitive payment. Let's get into the Sicha. So on the pasuk that it says Hashem spoke to Aaron and he says, "Behold, I am giving to you the gifts," right? As we said in the introduction. So Rashi quotes the words in the Dibur HaMaschil in the heading, "Va'ani hineni nasati lecha." Va'ani hineni nasati lecha. And I, behold, I am giving to you. And he gives 2 points. He makes 2 points, Rashi. Number 1, he says, what is the word hine? Behold, what does that mean? It says Rashi, besimcha. This is indicating that Hashem says, I'm doing this with great joy. I am happy to be doing this. And Rashi brings a source for this. If you recall the story of Moshe and Aaron, when Hashem said to Moshe, go back to Egypt to take out my children from there, he says, your brother Aaron will come towards you. And he uses the term, Hine yoytze likrasecha v'roacha v'savach b'libay. Behold, he will be coming out towards you, and he will rejoice, he will be happy. So Rashi says that you see Hine in the context of joy. So that's the first part of Rashi. The second part of Rashi says, Moshel lemelech. He brings a parable of a king that gave a field to someone that he really cared about, but he did not write a document. No, of course, if he didn't write the document, neither did he sign it, neither did he notarize it. Comes a person and challenges it. He laid a claim to that field. Says the king to that person, to the one he loves, he says to him, you know what? Going forward, anybody who wants to come and challenge, please, by all means, come and challenge. Why? Because what I'm going to do now is I am going to write a document. I'm going to make a shtar. I am going to not only write the document, I am going to seal it, and then I'm going to get it confirmed. I'm going to get it notarized in the courts. So too over here, because Korach came, says Rashi, and he challenged the validity of the kahuna, of the priesthood of Aaron. So the pasuk comes and says, you know what? I'm going to give you all the 24 gifts of the Kohanim in an everlasting covenant of salt. And says Rashi, this is the reason, lokach nismach lakan. This is the reason why Hashem put this topic of the gifts of the Kohanim in close proximity to the story of Korach, to what happened with Korach. Now here are the questions. Number 1, it seems that these are 2 separate things. The idea of Hine, meaning joy, and the idea of this parable, it seems to be 2 separate things. Yes, they're both related to the general story. But remember, Rashi is bringing it under the same heading, and that implies that they are indeed connected. How so? That's number 1. Number 2, when you examine, you look close to the words of Rashi, the actual expression. Rashi says that since somebody came and challenged, ba hakasuv, the pasuk came, the verse came, the kasuv means the writing came and was masmichit and put it in close proximity in order to indicate this, in order to express this. Now, the question is, why doesn't Rashi use the expression Omar Bo Hamokim, came Hashem, came the Almighty? In fact, in Rashi's source, the source for this parable is from the Sifri, and that's exactly the expression in the Sifri. The Sifri says, Bo Hamokim, that came Hashem and said, I am going to set this right. I am going to establish it for all times. Why does Rashi use the expression Bo HaKasav, that the pasuk came, not that the verse came, versus that Hashem came? Then the question is, why does Rashi have to indicate the number of the gifts to the Kohanim? Why does he have to stress that it's Chav Daled Matnis Kuna, the 24 various gifts allotted to the Kohanim? Why wouldn't it suffice to just say that Hashem gave them all these gifts? Moreover, if you examine the psukim, the verses here, the 24 Matnis Kuna are not mentioned. Only several of them, but not all of them. So why would Rashi stress that? Another question, in the end of Rashi stresses and he says, Ulakach nismecha parsha Ulakan. And therefore this parsha was placed in close proximity. It was juxtaposed with the episode of Korach. Why doesn't Rashi just say, and again, drawing from his source, where in his source in Sifri it says, Ulekach nemra parsha Zukan. That's why this parsha was said here. Why does Rashi say it was just juxtaposed instead of just saying it was said here? Now, question number 4 that we just asked, namely, why does he say nismecha versus nemra? Why does he say it was juxtaposed? It was written in proximity versus being said, can actually answer question number 2, where we asked, why does he say Baha Kasuv, that the pasuk came, that the verse came and put it close by, instead of, or allotted him the gifts of Kahuna, instead of saying came Hashem Baha Mokoim, right? Well, it answers because Rashi is telling us it's not that it was said here. These gifts of Kahuna were not allotted to the Kohanim right after this episode. They were not said here in this particular time chronologically. Rather, they were said at another time. They were said elsewhere. And in fact, many of these gifts are already mentioned previously in the Torah and Chumash Vayikra and other places. And some of the gifts will be mentioned later, only later in the book of Devarim. But rather, Rashi's emphasis is not that they were said here, but rather that they were written here, that Hashem chose to write them here in close proximity to the story of Korach. And that's why he uses the expression Boha Kosev, because it's not Boha Mokim that Hashem came and gave it to him here. No, Hashem gave it to him already before. This is Hashem, the pasuk, Hashem dictating the verses, decided to write it here to emphasize this point, to bring out this idea. But the question is, why, in fact, do we must say, according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, that these things were said before, but just that the point over here is that they were written here? Because we see this is the emphasis in Rashi. Says the Rabbi, the explanation is as follows. In the verses here we see that in terms of the actual matnois kahuna, in terms of gifts for the kohanim, there's no novelty, there's no addition here whatsoever in terms of what the kohanim receive. In other words, all the gifts that are actually mentioned here have been mentioned elsewhere prior in the Torah. The only thing that is added here, the only thing that does really get emphasized here is in the beginning where Hashem stresses that I'm giving you these gifts are lemashcha, for distinction, and then in the end, in the verse 19, in Pasuk Yutes, where it says that this is Bris Melech Olam. That's the only real, so to speak, accomplishment, the only real novelty of this saying over here in regards to the 24 Matnes Kuhuna. And therefore, we must explain, according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, that when it says, Hine, behold, I've given to you, that it doesn't mean that now I am giving to you. It doesn't mean what Hine typically means, as the Rebbe will explain in a moment, but rather that I've already given it to you. I've already done this in the past. Now, Hine Nasati needs to be understood literally, Nasati in past tense. I've already given that which is written elsewhere, and therefore Rashi is compelled to tell us that over here, it's not that it's being given now, but rather that it has been given, is just being written here to emphasize this point. And now we'll understand and appreciate why Rashi explains the word hine as meaning joy. You see, because hine has generally two basic meanings. The common meaning it has is, it's hine means behold, here, which is really a shorter version of hineni, hineani, behold, here I am, I'm ready to do it, I'm ready to act. I'm ready to take an action, something in the present. As for example, where it says, Pari says to Avrohom Avinu, here, take your wife and go. Or when something we recite every morning, Avrohom Avinu sees the ram, vayar v'hinei, meaning it's right there, ready for the taking. Hine is usually an indicator of something that's right here, present, ready to go, ready to do. You are set to do it. Now, why would you need to say the word hine? In other words, what is really behind the idea of saying hine? Here I am, ready to do, ready to go. So we find in several places in the Torah, several sources, where we see that hine is used in order to counter, in order to express a novelty, to counter the norm. What does that mean? For example, when Hashem says, Va'ani hinini mevi mabu, behold, I'm going to bring the flood over the world. Well, that is somewhat of a novelty because it counters already a preset notion. What was that preset notion? Well, Hashem said prior to this, when Hashem said prior to this, look, not that many verses prior to this, in the Parshas Bereshis it says, Hashem saw that everything that he did was perfect. Suddenly it's not perfect, and suddenly he has to change course. Hine. Or when it says, Vatoimer Sarai el Avrohom, Sarai said to Avrohom, Hine no atzarani lekim eladis, that behold, Hashem held me back from giving birth. Again, that is countering the norm, because the norm is that a woman gives birth. And here she's saying that she is not able to give birth. Again, the word hine applies. So we see hine applies either to indicate something you're doing right here, right now, or when you're changing, so to speak, a normal course of things. When you are countering something, you have to emphasize that this is a novelty. But over here, you cannot say that hine is any of these meanings that we just said. Why? Because all these things were already given before. So it's not that it's being done now, number one. Number two, it's not like you're countering some norm. It's already the norm. It's already been established as a normal protocol that the Kohanim receive these things. And in fact, a lot of these gifts have already been mentioned before. That's what compelled Rashi to say that hine over here means besimcha, at a joy. Because again, it wasn't said here. It's not going to be said here. It was already said before. It's just being placed here. Bo hakasuv, the Torah came and wrote it here to bring out this point, to emphasize this idea, and therefore hine means joy. And then Rashi says, where do we see such a thing? So he brings the proof from Aaron. Because by Aaron, what happened? Normally, a brother would be perhaps upset. The older brother is coming to greet his younger brother who's going to get a greater position than him. Typically, the normal reaction of most people would be somewhat of an animosity, not the opposite of happiness. And Hashem says to him, Hine, he's going to come out, he's going to see you, and he's going to rejoice. Now, where do we appreciate that there is really a joy here? In other words, how do we actually see that this is tied in with joy? That's why Rashi emphasizes that there are chaf dalid matanis, that there are 24 gifts, meaning there is a ribui, a plentifulness of gifts, not one gift, not two gifts, not three gifts. There are so many gifts. How does this indicate that this is really a matter of joy? See, because before, in order to prove the authenticity and the authority of the kahuna, one action was enough. One stick started to blossom, and that was enough to establish it and set the record straight. And yet over here, we see that there are 24 matnes kahuna, because this is not just to establish something, this is to express the great joy that Hashem has in doing so. To say that he is the correct Kohen, and this is the way it's going to be, and it's being established forever, and it's a matter of joy. And now we can appreciate why Rashi brings the mashal. You remember we asked in the beginning, why is this parable necessary? And especially as one continuum under the same heading in the Rashi. You see, because what Rashi is basically pointing out is that there is two emphases here. There are 2 points that are being emphasized. Number one, that there's a plentifulness of gifts, the 24 gifts, right? That the Bo HaKosiv, that the Pasuk came and emphasizes this. And number two, that it's been established here, Bris Melach Olam, that this is going to be a covenant, an everlasting covenant like a salt. In other words, what it was saying is that it did not suffice the fact that Aaron's staff had blossomed and proved the authenticity, the validity of his priesthood, but rather that you need to add 2 more things. And that's why he brings the parable. Because in the parable, what do you see? Quote, he writes, which this is perhaps comparable to the giving of the 24 gifts. It's like establishing it, writing it. That's like Hashem's document. And then signing. Signing, this is like establishing the covenant. And moreover, not just signing, but notarizing it, confirming it, so to speak, in the courts, where this is that turning it in not just to any covenant, but the covenant of Melach Olam, the covenant of the soul, the everlasting covenant. You see, in general, what is the advantage? What is really the value of having a document? Is that you can prove your ownership even when you're not present in the place. Even when you're not standing in the field, actively portraying the fact that you're the owner, you can be thousands of miles away. With that document, you can prove, I am the owner of that field, of that property. Likewise, the gifts of the kahuna. A lot of the gifts, or perhaps a significant portion of these gifts, are not exclusive to the Beis HaMikdash. In fact, where they're given, all over Eretz Yisrael, far, far away from the Beis HaMikdash. That is inherent of a shtar, of a document, that it can be proven even elsewhere, not just in the Beis HaMikdash, where the Kohanim are actively serving Hashem, doing the service, that it can be proven that they are indeed the proper Kohanim, and it's all valid. Now, it's not enough to write it only, because then it can be challenged, and therefore he adds the covenant and the Melach Olam, the everlasting salt. That Hashem made a covenant with Aaron that kahuna, priesthood, would last forever, even when Chas v'Sholom there's no Beis HaMikdash. Now, says the Rebbe, we can see some of the wonderful things that appear in Rashi. Rashi emphasizes that there are 24 gifts. Why did he have to emphasize 24 gifts? We asked the question. He could have just said there was a plentifulness of gifts. There were many, many, many gifts. See, there's something here. What was this coming to challenge? This was coming to challenge, and to assure that it never happens again, the argument of Korach. How did Korach go about making his argument? How did he get everybody riled up against Moshe and Aaron? The answer is he did it in a manner of geneva, of thievery. He actually went around discreetly luring the people. He didn't come out and say, look, I want to be the Kohen. He came and said, no, I'm fighting for you. He did it in a very conniving, in a very luring manner, in a very deceitful manner. This is tantamount to geneva. And therefore, when there is a geneva involved, as we explained in the introduction, there is always the punitive payment of kefil. Now, how many of the tribes did he manage to seduce, to lure? 12. Well, 12 times 2 is 24. And thus the emphasis of the 24 gifts of the kahuna. Now, of course, one can ask, wait, but you also have the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi was also part of the argument against, in fact, Korach himself was a Levi. Well, for that's been taken care of already. Because remember, once Korach was punished, and then later they had, again, the challenge of all the Yidden, of all the tribes, the 12 tribes were still challenging. And they put the staffs in the Mishkan. Well, Aaron's staff was not just on behalf of Aaron and the Kahuna family and the priestly family, but in fact it says Aaron's staff was there as a representation of the entire Shevet Levi. So that was already, so to speak, taken care of. That business has been already resolved. Shevet Levi and the kahuna no longer can counter each other. No longer will there ever be a challenge from Shevet Levi to the kahuna, to the priesthood. It's all become one thing. However, the 12 tribes, that still remains, so to speak, somewhat of a possibility of challenge. And for that, Hashem says, you got the 24 gifts of kahuna, and it becomes solidified. It's like it's written, it's signed, and notarized in the court, and therefore, it's all taken care of. Says the Rebbe, we could say a very interesting thing. It happens to be that this parsha is always read either right before or in the beginning of the month of Tammuz, the month in which the previous Rebbe was released from his arrest. And what happened? Why was he arrested? He was arrested for spreading Yiddishkeit, for being determined in insisting that Yiddishkeit go on, continue on, spreading Yiddishkeit. Well, just like a document, just like what happened here, when you have a matter that's challenged, initially, it looks like a very scary thing. It seems to threaten the whole the existence of the whole thing. However, that brings to the fact that it becomes now confirmed and established and irreversible, irrevocable. And it's exactly what happened by the Frierdiker Rebbe. By the previous Rebbe, first they tried to challenge his ability to spread Yiddishkeit. What came as a result? Not only they had to release him, but this established the fact that whatever the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to do, not only can continue on, but continue on with much greater strength and much greater passion. And of course, all this will lead us towards Mashiach.